Good evening, everybody. Hi, it's Dr. Bob here at Your Vitality Project. I appreciate so much you joining me tonight. Thank you. We had a guest scheduled for tonight. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it, and he'll be joining us next week. So it gives me a chance to give you a quick review of where we've been in the last few weeks in our posts, and also point in the direction of where we're going. So I'm happy to take this little hiatus as a chance to kind of catch up with you and also hopefully inspire your interest. What we've been looking at for the last few weeks is how do we build resilience? How do we enhance or create resilience? In fact, I think of resilience as kind of the antidote to relapse. So if you think of relapse to addictive behaviors, whether it's addiction to a substance or some other problematic behavior, or even an attitude, that the very opposite of that is what can we do to balance the body and the brain to enhance our resilience, to help us to bounce back, to bounce up. And so one of the themes that we've been looking at in the last several posts is looking at how it is that if we fall into what we've been calling a victim identity, where we feel done to, it's next to impossible not to fall down the rabbit hole of increasing resentment, anxiety, worry, stress, depression. All of these things lead towards addictive relapse. And so we're looking at what can we do to deactivate this victim role, this victim identity. So we've been looking at various coping strategies. One of those, and it's a core one, is can I build the capacity to be with disappointment? Can I build the capacity to be with frustration and to authentically grieve those experiences and accept them? You'll find this in the 12-step programs. If that's been any part of your own recovery, there's a real focus on acceptance. There's a real focus on surrendering. And what it is we're surrendering is this kind of victim identity where we feel like that life would be fine if people would just give us the respect that we deserve. Sometimes people do, and sometimes they don't. But the one key variable is how I respond to that. And that's what we're talking about, is building resilience by establishing an acceptance of those things that we can change and a realization of those things we can't, and a willingness to surrender trying to control reality, life, to match our expectations. We talk about expectations in terms of requirements, how it is that we can place absolute requirements on existence, and then when existence doesn't supply the longed for solution, where our requirements aren't met, then of course we end up, as one client put it, we end up barbecuing in our own adrenaline. And so we're trying to manage a different way of living. And the goal here is not only a recovery from addiction, but really a life of joy, of peace, of vitality. Really, that's what we're looking for. So what I assigned this last week was a homework assignment where I asked you, and you may have participated in this, and if you haven't, I'll challenge you to do that this coming week, is that the skills that we've been discussing, I asked you to kind of create a checklist or monitor how you're progressing with these. So if you take a blank sheet of paper, and if you put at the very top our goal, which is to deactivate the victim, and I put victim in quotation marks. I'm in no way denying the fact that victimization occurs. What I'm concerned about is where that establishes itself as a firm and solid identity, and then it ends up being a burden that we can scarcely bear. So we're going to be working on deactivating the victim. That would be across the top. And down the left-hand side, I wanted you to list some of the skills that we've talked about. I'm going to list them right now, and I'm going to recommend, if you're not familiar with them, that you go back and review the last week or two or three of daily posts and homework exercises that have helped to instill these skills, at least as a beginning in our resilience repertoire. So on the left-hand side, here's one example. When I can recognize requirements, especially when I'm distressed, that can be a very important skill to realize I've got a requirement here, which is things shouldn't be going this way. And so the first skill is being able to recognize that we're caught in that requirement, even when reality is not supplying us any option besides being face to face with the frustration of that requirement. The next piece goes hand in hand with it, which is, write this down, convert requirements to preferences, which is to say we have every right to have preferences, wishes that we wish things were different. But if they're not, then what can we do? That brings us to the third item, which is to practice mindfulness, whether distressed or not. And we've been talking about almost every post, close to every post, has been providing instructions in our developing a capacity to focus our attention away from whatever problems we're facing. We've been picking the breath as an anchor to be able to relax our bodies and brains mindfully, so that when we face a frustration, we have a higher likelihood of moving out of that requirement mode into the capacity to have preferences, but let go of the requirements. We've talked about this as that the requirement mode is aided and abetted by the red alert brain. That's the survival center of the brain. And we can actually train our brains to relax that death grip on that survival center of the brain and move from red alert brain into resting brain. And in resting brain, we can actually relax the stranglehold that we put on reality around requirements and be able to be much more likely to relax into preferences. Some of the things that get revealed in this work, and this is another coping strategy that we've looked at, is can I identify negative storylines in whatever is going on in my life? So for example, if something happens that frustrates me, I'll just pick an example. I'll pick an example from high school. When I was in high school, I played on a very competitive tennis team. We were champions year after year, and I was very honored to be on that team, but very, very high standards. And that's kind of good news, bad news. The good news is we won. We were undefeated year after year. The bad news is we never lost, and so we couldn't dare lose. And so those expectations ground in hard into that 16, 17, 18-year-old boy's psyche. And so I can still remember one night coming home and I lost a challenge match. It was amongst our team. I was wanting to go up. They call it the ladder. I wanted to advance up the ladder. And I met my match. The guy that I lost to, his name was Wes. I remember Wes very clearly. And he beat me that day. And I came home that night and I was really struggling. And here's the struggle. And this is where the negative storyline comes in. Is that I had a requirement that I beat Wes. I didn't beat him. The negative storyline that came up for me, although I'm sure that I didn't identify this at age 17 probably, the negative storyline would be, if I can't beat Wes, then it must not be that good. Or maybe the negative storyline is, if I lose, that makes me a loser. You can begin to imagine what that evoked. And this is one time for which I'm very grateful. My mom came in and sat with me and helped me to process my loss. And I'll never forget this, because the next morning I woke up and she left a note on my pillow. And she said how proud she was of me for my ability to finally move into accepting my loss of that challenge match to Wes. Well, obviously, I've never forgotten that. And it's nearly 50 years later. So it left a deep positive influence for me. So mom was helping me to get underneath my requirements, get underneath my negative storylines, and maybe find another way to manage what I was experiencing in terms of this at least temporary defeat. So we've talked about identifying negative storylines. The flip side of that is, can we identify what we've talked about here as fixer strategies? Can we identify fixer strategies? And fixer strategies are ways that we manage our depressor. They're ways that we manage the negative storyline by coming in and rescuing ourselves. So I'm thinking back to the example I gave you, which I thought of just right now to share it with you. I hadn't planned on that. It would have been very much like me to have a sleepless night and begin scheming and planning, how can I beat Wes? How can I beat Wes? And the solution would be beating Wes, beating him in the next tennis challenge match. There was this isn't about erasing ambition, but it's that fixer strategy would have had a drivenness to it. I call it an unrelenting standard. I could have set an unrelenting standard for myself that I will not be happy until I beat Wes. And that would have made my peace of mind completely contingent on my winning the next challenge match with Wes. And in fact, that conversation that night with my mom helped me to relax that. So I slept that night and actually never forgot her note to me on the pillow the next morning. Very important lesson that I learned. And so can we identify the ways that we try to fix our problems and create more of a thicket of problems by doing that? This comes up all the time in my work with severe addiction and recovery from severe addiction. Most of the clients I work with have had severe addictions to substances, and most all of them, if we dive deep enough into the addictive process, will recognize that one of the ways that we try to manage our distress, the depressor, is by at least temporarily self-medicating with some kind of chemical substance that at least temporarily gives us relief. And there's a place here for compassion for anybody who's been addicted, because that really represents a fixer strategy par excellence. The problem with every fixer strategy, including addiction to substances, is that the consequences end up costing more and more and more, and become less and less worth the price that's paid for that temporary fix. It's no accident that we call drug using, sometimes we talk about getting a fix. It literally is getting a fix to this distress. So what we're looking at are creative ways of managing our distress. We're looking under the umbrella here of what can I do to reduce my sense of victimization? How can I move more into an acceptance that has the capacity to grieve, that I don't need to fix with a substance or some other behavior? I don't need to beat Wes to be at peace. That's basically the story that we're sharing tonight. And how can I turn a requirement? I'd like to have beaten him, but I didn't. And is it required for me to have peace of mind to beat him? Is that a requirement? It doesn't have to be. I'll tell you a big fat secret. I'm not sure that I ever beat Wes after that. And it stopped bedeviling me. There was something about this process with my mom that helped me to let go of needing to beat him. He was a better tennis player, had a better probably tennis teacher than I did. And I could accept that. I came to where I could accept that. Our team went on to win championships, and I was very grateful to be on that team. And I wasn't dogged by the fact that Wes was a better tennis player than me. So that's what we've been looking at, is creating resilience in the face of frustration, resilience in the face of disappointment, resilience in the face of a lost match or a lost relationship or a lost job, a lost opportunity, lost finances, lost reputation. I'm naming things that go hand in hand with anybody that's been severely addicted and moved into recovery, because you'll know what I'm talking about. And obviously, if you've been with me, you know that I know this firsthand myself. What I want to do now, I'll just announce this briefly and then we'll be done for tonight. What I want to do next is I want to transition into applying these resilience strategies, such as deactivating the victim role, moving out of red alert brain into resting brain. I want to see if we can transition by bridging these skills to relationships. How do these skills show up, and how might they help to reinforce the strengths of my current relationships, and perhaps even build new strengths, as well as repair ruptures or breaks in other relationships as well. How can I apply these skills of mindfulness, of replacing requirements with preferences, of finding other ways to manage my disappointment and frustration than either getting stuck in the depressor's negative storylines on the one hand, or moving into a kind of a compulsive fixer strategy on the other hand? Is there a way to find some kind of balance? Well, I believe there is, and we plan to elucidate that over these next several posts over the next few weeks. And so I hope that you'll come join me. The title of this next series from Your Vitality Project is Reviving Our Relationships. So we're looking at reviving or revitalizing our relationships and finding ways of skillfully arcing over from coping strategies that we've learned these last weeks and months and tying them into then the in between relationships. I can't wait for this new unit. It's one that I care deeply about. I'm hoping to have a few guests join me. I'll have one guest joining me next Wednesday. 𝗂𝗏 Thompson will be joining me here. And I also have a friend who I believe is going to be joining me from Australia. Ian is a therapist with whom I feel deep, deep kinship. We're very, very much kindred hearts in looking at the heart of recovery as being what the British journalist 𝗂𝗏 𝗁 has put so eloquently. Many of you have seen his TED Talk. If you haven't, please look up 𝗂𝗏 𝗁, H-A-R-I. And his TED Talk is something along the lines of, everything you've ever learned about addiction is wrong. It's close to that. I don't think that's verbatim the title. But the final line of that video is unforgettable. And I highly recommend that you see it. And it goes right into the heart of something that my friend Ian and I have been talking about that is a blind spot far too often in addiction recovery. And it has to do with relationships. And I want to quote 𝗂𝗏 𝗁, and I'll finish with that tonight. 𝗂𝗏 𗁁 says, "The opposite of addiction is not sobriety." What is it? It's connection. And so we'll be looking at connection in depth these next days, these next weeks. And I hope you'll come back to join me here at Your Vitality Project. Thank you for joining me tonight. I send love and blessings to all. Take good care and have a good evening.